You are standing on the roof of a building in Constantinople. It is November 1st, 1922. Below you, the streets are quiet in a way that feels wrong. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of something ending. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, is leaving, not in a procession, not with ceremony, not with the thunder of cannon fire or the wailing of a court. He is leaving in a British ambulance, wrapped in a coat, slipping out of the Dolmabahce Palace in the early morning dark, making his way to a waiting warship. He glances back at the palace once, then he does not look back again. And just like that, in the back of an ambulance, at 6 a.m, without a single gun being fired, 600 years of empire end. No empire in history lasted as long as the Ottoman Empire while remaining a genuinely functioning, genuinely powerful, genuinely feared state. 600 years. From a tiny tribal principality in the hills of northwestern Anatolia in 1299 to an empire that at its height controlled 3 continents, administered 80 million people, governed territories from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, and served for centuries as the most powerful political entity in the known world. And then it fell. Not in a single dramatic collapse, not a Waterloo, not a last stand, not a sacking of the capital by barbarian armies. It fell the way most great things fall. Slowly, then all at once, through a long accumulation of mistakes, miscalculations, bad luck, missed opportunities, external pressures, internal fractures, and the particular grinding cruelty of being a pre-modern empire trying to survive in a rapidly modernizing world. The story of how the Ottoman Empire fell is one of the most consequential stories in modern history. The Middle East, as it exists today, its borders, its conflicts, its identities, its fractures, is largely a product of what happened to the Ottoman Empire and what the great powers did with its corpse afterward. The First World War, the Armenian Genocide, the creation of modern Turkey, the birth of Arab nationalism, the Balfour Declaration, and the origins of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the division of Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. All of it flows from this story. If you want to understand the world you live in, you need to understand how this empire died. So that is what we are going to do. We are going to start at the peak, when the Ottoman Empire was genuinely terrifying, genuinely magnificent, genuinely the envy of the world, and we are going to follow the long, complicated, painful road all the way to that ambulance, leaving in the dark. We are going to meet the sultans who tried to save it, the reformers who nearly succeeded, the wars that bled it dry, the nationalists who tore it apart from within, and the great powers that circled it like wolves, waiting for it to stop moving. And along the way, we are going to ask the question that makes this story genuinely interesting. Was the fall of the Ottoman Empire inevitable? Or were there moments, real, documented, specific moments, where things could have gone differently? Where a different decision, a different sultan, a different war might have produced a different world? The answer is more complicated than you probably expect. Let us get into it. Chapter 1. The giant at its peak. What the Ottomans actually built. To understand how something falls, you first have to understand what it was at its best. And the Ottoman Empire at its best was genuinely extraordinary. Not just by the standards of its own time, but by any standard. Let us go back to the beginning, briefly, because the origin story matters. In the late 13th century, the great Mongol invasions had shattered the political landscape of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had dominated the region, was in ruins. In its place, a dozen small Turkish principalities, called beyliks, were scrambling for territory and power. One of them, in the northwest corner of Anatolia near the Byzantine frontier, was led by a man named Osman. He was a minor tribal chief. His principality was tiny. He had maybe a few thousand warriors. Nobody at the time would have put money on his descendants ruling the world. But Osman had something the other Beylik rulers did not, or at least not in the same measure. A location right on the Byzantine border, which meant constant access to raiding, to Ghazi warfare, holy war against the infidel, which attracted fighters from across the Muslim world, and to the increasingly available real estate of a Byzantine empire that was, by the late 13th century, already in serious decline. His warriors were motivated. His location was ideal. His timing was perfect. And whatever personal qualities he had, and the sources are too sparse and too legend contaminated to be sure, he built something durable enough that his sons and grandsons could expand it far beyond anything he himself achieved. The empire that Osman founded, named after him the Osmanli, which we call Ottoman, grew with startling speed. His son Orhan took Bursa in 1326, making it the first Ottoman capital. His grandson Murad I crossed into Europe in the 1360s, establishing a foothold in Thrace that would become the launching pad for the conquest of the Balkans. By 1389, the Ottomans had defeated a coalition of Serbian, Bosnian, and other Balkan forces at the Battle of Kosovo, a battle whose mythology still echoes through Serbian nationalism today. By 1396, they had crushed a massive Western crusade at Nicopolis, a defeat so comprehensive that it effectively ended serious European attempts to dislodge them from the Balkans for generations. Then came Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, and the moment that changed everything. In 1453, at the age of 21, Mehmed besieged Constantinople. The city had been the capital of the Roman Empire, then the Byzantine Empire, for over 1,000 years. Its walls had held against dozens of sieges. Its symbolic weight was almost incomprehensible. This was the city of Constantine, the city where the last embers of Rome had been kept burning for a millennium after the fall of the West. And Mehmed took it in 53 days. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe and the Islamic world simultaneously. In Europe, it was experienced as a catastrophe. The loss of the last Christian outpost in the East, a wound to Christendom's pride that generated enormous amounts of hand-wringing, papal appeals for crusade, and very little actual military response. In the Islamic world, it was experienced as a triumph of almost eschatological proportions. The Prophet Muhammad had reportedly said that Constantinople would one day be conquered by Muslims, and now it had been, and the conqueror was 21 years old and had just made himself the most celebrated ruler in the Islamic world. Mehmed renamed the city Istanbul, though the name Constantinople persisted in European usage for centuries, and immediately set about transforming it into an imperial capital worthy of the empire he intended to build. He repopulated it with settlers from across the empire, restored the Hagia Sophia as a mosque, built the Topkapi Palace on the hill overlooking the Bosphorus, and made clear that he was not a local Turkish chief playing an empire. He was the heir of Rome, the Caesar of a new universal empire, and he intended to be taken seriously. The empire continued to expand under Selim I, Selim the Grim, a ruler whose nickname tells you everything you need to know about his management style. The Ottomans in the early 16th century conquered Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz, which meant the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. This was not just a territorial acquisition. It made the Ottoman Sultan the custodian of the two holy mosques, the protector of the most sacred sites in Islam, the the de facto leader of the Sunni Muslim world. The Ottoman Empire was no longer just a military power. It was a religious one, and its sultan was not just a king. He was a caliph, the successor to the Prophet's political authority over the community of believers. Then came Suleiman I, Suleiman the Magnificent, as Europeans called him, Suleiman the Lawgiver, as his own subjects knew him, and the empire reached its absolute zenith. Under Suleiman, the Ottomans besieged Vienna in 1529, the high water mark of Ottoman expansion into Europe, the moment when the empire was at its furthest reach. They dominated the Mediterranean. They allied with France against the Habsburgs, which meant that the most powerful Muslim empire in the world and the most powerful Catholic kingdom in Europe were geopolitical partners, a fact that the Pope found deeply inconvenient and morally disorienting. The empire that Suleiman ruled was genuinely impressive by any standard. It administered enormous diversity: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Slavs, Kurds, Berbers, and dozens of other peoples, through a sophisticated system of governance that, while hardly gentle by modern standards, was considerably more tolerant of religious and ethnic diversity than most contemporary European states. The millet system gave non-Muslim communities, Christians and Jews, substantial autonomy to govern their own internal affairs under their own religious law. This was not liberal democracy. It was a practical accommodation of reality, but it worked after a fashion for a very long time. The Ottoman capital, Istanbul, was one of the great cities of the world, perhaps the greatest, in terms of sheer size and cosmopolitan energy. It was a city of perhaps 700,000 people by the 16th century, larger than any city in Europe, a place where you could hear a dozen languages in the bazaar on any given morning, where the smell of coffee. The Ottomans introduced coffee to Europe, mixed with the call to prayer and the cries of merchants and the bells of Christian churches that still operated under Ottoman rule. The Ottomans built mosques that rivaled anything in the world. The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1558 under Suleiman, is one of the supreme architectural achievements of human civilization. They built a legal code, the Kanun, that systematized governance in ways that went beyond religious law and applied across the empire. They developed a remarkable system of elite infantry, the Janissaries, recruited from Christian boys, taken through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, educated in palace schools, and formed into a military and administrative elite of remarkable quality. At its best, this system produced some of the most capable soldiers and administrators in the world. It also produced eventually one of the most dangerous internal power blocks in the empire's history. But we will get to that. The point is this: the Ottoman Empire, at its height, was not a backwater. It was not primitive. It was not a footnote to European history. It was the most powerful empire in the world, administering more territory, more people, and more diversity than any of its contemporaries. When we talk about its fall, we are talking about the fall of something genuinely great, and that matters because it means the fall required real explanation, real causes, real failures, real decisions. It did not fall because it was always weak. It fell because something changed. Several things changed, and understanding what those things were is the whole story. Chapter 2: The Sick Man of Europe. When the cracks began to show you are an Ottoman officer. It is September 12th, 1683. You are outside Vienna. You have been outside Vienna for 2 months. The siege is not going well. The city has not fallen. The relief army has not been stopped. And now today, Something is going very wrong on the right flank. An enormous cavalry charge, Polish hussars, the heavy cavalry of the Commonwealth, the most feared mounted warriors in Europe, is coming down the hill. And before the day is over, the Ottoman army, one of the largest ever assembled in Europe, some 150,000 men, will be in full retreat. The second siege of Vienna has failed, and nothing about the Ottoman Empire will ever quite be the same again. The first siege of Vienna in 1529 had ended in an Ottoman retreat, but that had been explainable. Suleiman had arrived too late in the season. The supply lines were stretched. The weather turned bad. It was a setback, not a reversal. The empire went on to dominate the Mediterranean, conquer Hungary, and remain the overwhelming military power in the region for the next century and a half. But the second siege of Vienna in 1683 was different. It came after decades of signs that the empire's military edge was dulling, that its administrative system was creaking, that the spectacular quality of its early sultans was not being matched by their successors. The empire that besieged Vienna in 1683 was not the empire of Suleiman the Magnificent. It was an empire being run in practice by a Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, while the Sultan, Mehmed IV, spent his time hunting. The military planning was overconfident. The siege tactics were flawed. And when the relief came, led by the Polish King John III Sobieski, the Ottoman army collapsed with a speed that shocked even its enemies. The failure at Vienna opened a catastrophic period. The Holy League, Austria, Venice, Poland, and later Russia launched a sustained counteroffensive that, over the next 16 years, stripped the Ottomans of Hungary and much of the Balkans. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 was the first major peace treaty in which the Ottomans were the losing side, the first time they had been forced to cede significant territory to European powers. It was, in the words of one Ottoman chronicler, a treaty signed in tears. Now, it would be a mistake to say that Vienna was the turning point, the single moment where everything changed. History is rarely that clean. The Ottoman Empire went on fighting for another 2 centuries, winning some wars, losing others, making significant recoveries at various points. But Vienna did crystallize something important, a shift in the underlying military balance between the Ottomans and their European rivals that had been building for decades and would only widen over time. What caused this shift? Several things, operating simultaneously. And this is important because the Ottoman decline was never the product of a single cause. It was the product of a structural gap that kept widening. The first cause was the military revolution in Europe. Starting roughly in the late 16th century, European armies underwent a fundamental transformation. The adoption of firearms, the development of new drill techniques, the reorganization of infantry tactics, the improvement of artillery. This was not a one-time upgrade. It was a continuous process of military innovation driven by the almost constant warfare between European states, which meant that any state that fell behind in military technology and technique was rapidly punished. European armies in 1683 were genuinely different, more disciplined, more flexibly commanded, more effectively supplied than European armies in 1529. The Ottomans had adopted firearms early and effectively, and their own military had been formidable in the 16th century. But the continuous pressure of European interstate competition drove military innovation at a pace the Ottomans could not match, partly because they did not face the same competitive pressure within their own borders. The second cause was economic. The Ottoman economy in the 16th century had been prosperous and well organized, But the 17th century brought serious trouble. The flood of silver from the New World, Spanish silver from the mines of Potosi and Mexico, caused inflation across the entire connected economy of Europe and the Middle East. The Ottomans, heavily integrated into this economy, were hit hard. Soldiers' pay, fixed in silver, lost purchasing power. The treasury strained. Tax revenues, calibrated to older price levels, failed to keep up with the government's costs. The result was fiscal pressure that forced increasingly aggressive taxation, which created unrest in the provinces, which required military action to suppress, which cost money the treasury did not have. The third cause was institutional. The Janissary system, the Devshirme recruited elite soldiers who had been the backbone of Ottoman military power, began to deteriorate in the 17th century. Originally forbidden to marry or engage in trade, the Janissaries had gradually acquired both privileges, and by the 17th century they had become a hereditary military caste, more interested in protecting their privileges than in fighting wars. Their numbers grew far beyond what was militarily useful. Their quality declined. Their political influence expanded enormously. Janissaries made and unmade sultans demanded ever larger bribes and stipends and violently resisted any military reform that threatened their position. The Janissary Corps, which had once been the empire's greatest military asset, had become its greatest military liability. The fourth cause was political. The early Ottoman sultans had been, by any standard, exceptional rulers. Osman, Orhan, Murad I, Bayezid I, Mehmed II, Selim I, Suleiman I. This is a remarkable run of capable, often brilliant leaders over 2.5 centuries. But after Suleiman, the quality of sultans declined sharply. This was partly structural. Suleiman's successors were raised not in the active world of campaigns and governance as their predecessors had been, but in the cafes, the cage, a set of apartments within the palace, where princes were isolated from the world to prevent them from building power bases that might threaten the reigning sultan. Princes grew up in the cafes without education and governance, without military experience, without any real understanding of the empire they would one day rule. When they emerged to become sultan, they were often psychologically damaged, politically naive, and entirely dependent on the court factions that had managed their isolation. The result was sultans who increasingly ruled in name only, while real power shifted to the grand viziers, the harem factions, the Janissary commanders, and the ulama, the religious scholars who had their own institutional interests to protect. The empire did not lack capable administrators entirely. There were periods like the Kuprulu era of the mid-17th century, when strong grand viziers effectively revived Ottoman military fortunes. But the structural dependence on individual personalities in a system that was now systematically producing weak sultans was a serious vulnerability. The phrase "sick man of Europe" was coined by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia in 1853, describing the Ottoman Empire to the British ambassador. It was a diplomatic framing. Russia wanted Britain to agree to carve up the empire's territory between them, and calling it terminally ill was part of the sales pitch. But the phrase stuck, and it stuck because it captured something real. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was losing wars with regularity. It was losing territory with regularity. It was signing humiliating treaties. It was watching European powers establish footholds in its affairs, capitulations, commercial privileges, extraterritorial rights for foreign nationals that undermined its sovereignty in practice, even while its formal independence remained intact. And here is the painful irony. The Ottomans knew. The sultans and viziers of the 18th century were not oblivious. They could see what was happening. They could see the European armies defeating them. They could read the peace treaties. They could count the lost provinces. They were not sitting in Istanbul congratulating themselves on how well everything was going. They were desperately trying to figure out what to do about it. And their attempts to fix it, the reform projects of the 18th and early 19th centuries, are one of the most fascinating and ultimately heartbreaking stories in the history of any empire, because they almost worked. Several times they almost worked. And understanding why they ultimately did not is the key to understanding why the ambulance left in the dark in 1922. Chapter 3. The Tanzimat Gamble, trying to modernize a medieval empire at gunpoint. You are a young Ottoman official. It is 1839. Your name is Mustafa Rashid Pasha, and you have just spent years as ambassador to Paris and London. You have watched these countries operate. You have seen their legal systems, their newspapers, their parliaments, their railways, their factories. You have come back to Istanbul absolutely convinced of two things. First, that the Ottoman Empire must modernize or die. And second, that you know how to make it happen. Today, in the Rose Garden of the Topkapi Palace, you're going to read a decree that will, if it works, transform this empire from a medieval Islamic sultanate into something resembling a modern constitutional state. You take a breath. You begin to read. The Tanzimat, the word means reorganization in Ottoman Turkish, was the Ottoman Empire's great attempt at top-down modernization, and it lasted in various forms from 1839 to 1876. It was the most ambitious reform program the empire had ever attempted, and it came out of genuine desperation. The immediate context was humiliating. In the 1830s, the Ottoman Empire had been saved from military defeat not once, but twice by European intervention. And in the second case, the threat was not from a European power, but from Egypt. Muhammad Ali, the Ottoman governor of Egypt, had built a modernized army with French advisors and had effectively gone to war against his own nominal overlord, the Ottoman Sultan. The Egyptian army had defeated the Ottomans in Syria, was threatening Istanbul itself, and the empire had been saved only by Russian military intervention and then European diplomatic pressure. Saved by Russia, of all powers, the same Russia that had been the empire's most consistent and dangerous enemy for the previous century. It was, to put it mildly, not a great look. The Tanzimat reforms were a comprehensive package: legal, administrative, military, educational, and eventually constitutional. The Gulhan Edict of 1839, read by Mustafa Rashid Pasha in the Rosiya Garden, promised security of life and property for all Ottoman subjects, regardless of religion, a regular system of taxation to replace the arbitrary exactions that had crushed provincial populations, and the abolition of tax farming, which had been one of the most destructive practices in the imperial economy. These were not trivial promises. They were a direct assault on the existing power structure of the empire. In the following decades, the reforms deepened. A new penal code was introduced based on French models. A new commercial code followed. Secular schools were established alongside the traditional religious madrasas, training a new generation of bureaucrats and officers in modern subjects. The telegraph linked the empire's far-flung provinces to the capital. New roads and later railways began to connect previously isolated regions. The postal system was reorganized. Courts were secularized for commercial and criminal matters. The Meklai, councils at various levels, introduced at least a consultative element into governance. Most significantly, And most controversially, the Tanzimat reforms explicitly extended legal equality to non-Muslim subjects of the empire. The Reform Edict of 1856, issued under pressure from Britain and France after the Crimean War, in which the Ottomans had fought alongside those powers against Russia, went further than the 1839 edict in promising equal treatment, equal access to government positions, and equal legal standing for Christians and Jews alongside Muslims. This was a genuine revolution in the legal status of Ottoman minorities, and it was received with correspondingly mixed feelings, warmly by the minorities themselves and by European diplomats, and with varying degrees of alarm and resistance by the Muslim population and the religious establishment. The military was reformed too, multiple times with varying success. Mahmud II, before the Tanzimat proper, had managed to destroy the Janissaries in 1826 in what became known as the Auspicious Incident, a phrase that could only have been coined by the Sultan who ordered it. After decades of failed attempts to reform the Janissary corps, Mahmud finally moved against them directly. He provoked them into rebellion, then had them massacred by loyal troops and artillery. Thousands died. The corps was abolished. Mahmud then built a new army on Western models, with European-trained officers and European-style drill and equipment. This was genuinely brave. The Janissaries had been making and unmaking sultans for 2 centuries, and genuinely consequential. The new army was not immediately as good as the Janissaries had been at their best, but it was capable of improvement in a way the Janissaries had ceased to be. The peak of the Tanzimat era was the first constitutional period in 1876, when Sultan Abdul Hamid II, under pressure from reformist ministers, approved the Ottoman constitution and the creation of an Ottoman parliament. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the Ottoman Empire had a functioning legislature, elected representatives from across its vast territories, and a constitutional framework that many reformers hoped would be the foundation of a genuine political transformation. Members of parliament from Bulgaria sat next to members from Arabia. Christians, Jews, and Muslims debated legislation together. It was extraordinary. It lasted less than 2 years. Abdul Hamid II used the war with Russia in 1877 as a pretext to suspend the constitution and prorogue parliament. He then ruled as an autocrat for the next 30 years, keeping the constitution technically in existence but suspending it indefinitely, building a surveillance state of remarkable thoroughness. His secret police read mail, monitored conversations, and maintained informant networks that made dissent extremely dangerous, and pursuing a conservative Islamic politics that was simultaneously a genuine ideological commitment and a political tool for holding the empire's Muslim subjects together against nationalist pressures. The failure of the first constitutional period is one of the genuine hinge moments in Ottoman history, one of those places where things might have gone differently. Abdul Hamid was not wrong that the empire faced existential dangers. The 1877-78 war with Russia was catastrophic. The empire lost most of its remaining European territory, including Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees fled or were expelled from the Balkans, arriving in Anatolia traumatized and destitute. The Congress of Berlin in 1878, where the European great powers redrew the map of southeastern Europe, treated Ottoman interests with contemptuous indifference. The empire that emerged from 1878 was smaller, poorer and more frightened than the one that had entered 1876 with constitutional aspirations. But Abdulhamid's response to 30 years of autocratic rule, political repression, and conservative Islamic mobilization did not save the empire. It deferred the crisis, suppressed the symptoms, and allowed the underlying structural problems to fester. The nationalists he tried to suppress organized underground. The reforms he halted left the military and economy only half modernized, and the generation of young Turks who grew up under his regime, educated in the modern schools the Tanzimat had built, aware of European liberal ideas, watching the empire lose territory and dignity with each passing decade, were accumulating a fury that would eventually explode. The Tanzimat's failure was not total. It produced real changes: a modern legal system, a modern educational infrastructure, a class of trained bureaucrats and officers, a telegraph network, the beginnings of railway connection. Without the Tanzimat, the empire might have collapsed even sooner, but it did not produce what its architects had hoped for: a genuinely modernized, integrated Ottoman state capable of competing with European powers on something approaching equal terms. It produced instead a half-modernized state with a radicalized intelligentsia, a resentful traditional establishment, alienated minorities who had been promised equality and not received it, and a growing sense among both Muslims and non-Muslims that the Ottoman framework could not hold. That sense was right, but the manner of the unraveling, the specific way the empire came apart, the violence it produced, the world it left behind, was not inevitable. It was the product of specific decisions, specific wars, specific catastrophes. And those are what we turn to next. Chapter 4, The Young Turks. Revolution in the name of saving the empire. You are a junior Ottoman army officer. It is the summer of 1908. You have been posted to Macedonia, one of the most troubled, most violent, most ethnically tangled corners of the empire's remaining European territory. But you have been educated in the military schools built by the Tanzimat. You can read French. You have read about the French Revolution, about constitutionalism, about the rights of man. You look at the empire around you, the corruption, the lost wars, the humiliating European interventions, the Sultan's spy network that reads your mail and makes you lower your voice before you say anything honest, and you have had enough. You are not alone. There are thousands of men like you, organized in a secret society called the Committee of Union and Progress. And this summer, you are going to make your move. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 was one of the most dramatic events in Ottoman history and one of the most consequential. In July 1908, officers of the Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, whose members were popularly known as the Young Turks, launched a revolt in Macedonia. They demanded the restoration of the 1876 constitution that Abdulhamid II had suspended. They threatened to march on Istanbul if their demands were not met, and Abdulhamid, faced with a military revolt he was not certain he could suppress, capitulated. He restored the constitution. He recalled parliament. He announced elections. The response across the empire was extraordinary. People danced in the streets. Christians and Muslims embraced each other in public squares. Newspapers that had been suppressed for decades reappeared overnight. Political parties formed and dissolved and formed again in a matter of weeks. The mood was genuinely euphoric, a sense that the long nightmare of Abdulhamid's autocracy was over, that a new era of constitutional government and Ottoman renewal was beginning. In Istanbul, in Beirut, in Damascus, in Salonika, in Jerusalem, across the entire empire. People celebrated. That euphoria lasted roughly about a year. The problems began almost immediately, and they were structural. The Young Turks, specifically the CUP, had been excellent at conspiring. They were considerably less skilled at governing. The parliament they had restored was a genuinely diverse body. Turks, Arabs, Albanians, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, all sitting together, all with their own interests and constituencies and visions of what the restored constitutional order should mean. For the empire's non-Turkish populations, the revolution had raised hopes of genuine equality, genuine autonomy, genuine respect for their particular identities within an Ottoman framework. For the CUP's core leadership, who were predominantly Turkish nationalist in their cultural orientation, even when they used the language of Ottomanism, those expectations were, to put it gently, optimistic. There was also the immediate problem of Abdul Hamid himself. In April 1909, a counter-coup attempt, the 31st March incident in the Ottoman calendar, erupted in Istanbul. Driven by soldiers and religious conservatives who wanted to reverse the revolution and restore the old order. The CUP's military forces crushed it within days, and then, with the counter-coup defeated and their position secure, the QP did something that revealed exactly where their sympathies lay. They deposed Abdul Hamid entirely, replacing him with his younger brother, Mehmed V, a man of limited abilities and even more limited political ambitions, who was essentially a constitutional figurehead from the start. The deposition of Abdul Hamid was in many ways the moment when the Young Turks crossed from reformers into rulers, and the distinction mattered. As reformers, they had been united by what they opposed: Abdul Hamid's autocracy, the empire's decline, European interference. As rulers, they were divided by what they wanted. And what they wanted, it increasingly became clear, was not the same thing. The QP's ideological evolution across the years 1908 to 1913 was rapid and, in retrospect, alarming. The organization that had started as a loose coalition of constitutionalists, liberals, and reformists hardened into something much more specifically Turkish nationalist. Ottomanism, the idea that all subjects of the empire, regardless of religion or ethnicity, shared a common Ottoman identity, gave way, in the minds of the CUP leadership, to a more explicitly Turkish vision of what the empire was and should be. The non-Turkish populations of the empire, Arabs, Armenians, Kurds, Greeks, found that the constitutional revolution had not delivered the equality they had hoped for, but had instead delivered a new nationalism that was, in some respects, more threatening to their interests than Abdul Hamid's conservative paternalism had been. The KOBUP also became increasingly authoritarian. The period from 1908 to 1913 saw multiple elections, multiple government crises, multiple shifts in the balance of power between the QP and its opponents. In 1912, a rival coalition actually managed to force the QP from power in what became known as the Big Stick election, a vote conducted under such blatant pressure that the CUP lost anyway, which gives you a sense of how much goodwill they had burned through in 4 years of governance. In January 1913, with the empire in crisis over the First Balkan War, the CUP launched a coup, a literal armed takeover of the government, with officers bursting into a cabinet meeting and shooting the Minister of War, and installed a new government under their control. This was the raid on the Sublime Porte, and after it, the CUP ruled through a de facto dictatorship. The three men who dominated that dictatorship became known as the Three Pashas. Enver Pasha, the Minister of War. Young, brilliant, vain, reckless, and absolutely convinced of his own military genius. Talayat Pasha, the Minister of the Interior, the most politically capable of the three, a former telegraph operator who had risen through organizational talent and sheer ruthlessness. And Chamal Pasha, the Minister of the Navy, the most moderate of the three, which is saying something. These three men would make the decisions that drove the Ottoman Empire into the First World War on the losing side, oversaw the Armenian genocide, and presided over the empire's final unraveling. They were, in their way, genuinely capable men. They were also catastrophically wrong about some of the most important questions they faced. But before we get to the First World War, we need to talk about what happened in the Balkans. Because the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were not just a military disaster. They were a psychological rupture that shaped everything the three pashas did afterward, including the decisions that proved most fatal. Chapter 5. The Balkan Catastrophe. Losing Europe in 9 months. You are in Istanbul. It is November 1912. The news from the front is bad. It has been bad for weeks, and it keeps getting worse. Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, 4 small Balkan states that the Ottoman Empire had dominated for centuries, formed an alliance in the spring and declared war in October. In 3 weeks, the Bulgarian army was 60 kilometers from Istanbul. The Ottoman army, which the Young Turks had spent 4 years claiming to reform, collapsed with a speed that nobody had predicted. Edirne, Adrianople, the old Ottoman capital, the city of Selim I and Suleiman the Magnificent, one of the most symbolically important cities in the empire, was under siege. And in the coffeehouses of Istanbul, people were beginning to ask very quietly whether the capital itself would hold. The First Balkan War was the worst military defeat in Ottoman history since the disaster of 1877-78. And in some ways, it was worse than that, because it happened faster and with less excuse. The 1877-78 war had been fought against Russia, a great power with an enormous army, backed by pan-Slavic sentiment and imperial ambition. The 1912 war was fought against 4 small Balkan states that individually were not particularly formidable. The fact that they were able to combine, coordinate, and inflict a catastrophic defeat on the Ottoman military in a matter of weeks was a devastating indictment of the state of the army after 4 years of Young Turk rule. The losses were staggering. In the First Balkan War, the Ottoman Empire lost Macedonia, including the city of Salonika, which happened to be the birthplace of many of the CUP's leading figures, including Enver Pasha himself. It lost most of Thrace. It lost Albania. It lost Kosovo. It lost territory that the empire had held for 500 years, stripped away in 9 months. The armistice that ended the First Balkan War left the Ottomans with almost no European territory outside Istanbul and its immediate hinterland. Then, almost immediately, the Balkan alliance fell apart over the spoils, and the Second Balkan War began. Bulgaria fighting Serbia and Greece over Macedonia. The Ottomans used the opportunity to recapture Edirne, which was a genuine military success and a massive boost to Ottoman morale. Enver Pasha rode into Edirne personally, staging his entrance with the theatrical flair that was his defining characteristic and was celebrated as a hero. But the recovery of Edirne could not undo the scale of what had been lost. The Balkans, in which had been Ottoman for 5 centuries, were gone. The human cost of the Balkan Wars was enormous. The military casualties were significant, but the civilian catastrophe was worse. The wars were accompanied by systematic ethnic cleansing on all sides. Bulgarian, Serbian, and Greek forces expelled Muslim populations from the newly conquered territories with extreme violence. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees, many of them Turks, poured into Anatolia. They arrived having lost everything: their homes, their property, their communities, in many cases, their families. They brought with them stories of atrocity: villages burned, men executed, women assaulted, cemeteries desecrated. The psychological impact on Ottoman society, and specifically on the CUP leadership, was profound and lasting. This is a crucial point that is often underemphasized in accounts of the Ottoman end. The men who made the decisions that drove the empire into the First World War, Enver, Talat, Cemal, and their circle, were not making those decisions from a position of stability and confidence. They were making them in the aftermath of a trauma. They had watched the empire's European heartland stripped away in months. They had seen hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees arrive in Anatolia with nothing. They had been taught, viscerally and repeatedly, that the empire's non-Muslim minorities could not be trusted, that the Balkan Christian populations, who had lived under Ottoman rule for centuries, had sided with the empire's enemies the moment those enemies appeared capable of winning. This lesson, which was not entirely wrong, but was applied with a catastrophic lack of nuance, shaped everything that followed. It shaped the QP's increasingly aggressive Turkish nationalism. It shaped their suspicion of the empire's Armenian population when the First World War began. It shaped their willingness to take drastic, violent action against populations they perceived as potentially disloyal. The Balkan Wars did not cause the Armenian genocide. Nothing is that simple. But they created the psychological and political context in which the genocide became thinkable to men who had, a few years earlier, spoken the language of Ottoman brotherhood and constitutional equality. There was also a geostrategic lesson the CUP drew from the Balkan catastrophe that proved equally fateful. The empire could not survive without a great power patron. The European powers had intervened diplomatically to limit the Balkan states' gains, saving Istanbul, probably. But they had done so out of their own interests, not out of any concern for Ottoman survival. Britain was increasingly focused on the naval rivalry with Germany. France was France. Russia was the enemy, which left Germany, the one great power that had been consistently friendly, that had been sending military advisors, that had been building railways and selling weapons, and that seemed genuinely interested in the Ottoman Empire as a partner rather than a patient to be carved up. That calculation, made in the shadow of the Balkan catastrophe, led directly to the alliance that would finally destroy the empire. But it did not feel like destruction at the time. At the time, it felt like the last chance at salvation. Chapter 6. The Fatal Alliance. How Germany dragged the Ottomans into the war that killed them. You are Enver Pasha. It is the summer of 1914. Europe is going to war. That much is clear. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June has set off a chain reaction that nobody seems capable of stopping. And within weeks, the continent's great powers are mobilizing. You have a decision to make. The Ottoman Empire can stay neutral, as most of your cabinet colleagues want, or it can enter the war. And if it enters, it has to choose a side. Britain and France, who have been interfering in Ottoman affairs for a century, treating the empire as a problem to be managed and eventually divided. Or Germany, which has been investing, advising, building, and, crucially, not demanding territorial concessions. You know what you think. You have always known what you think. The question is whether you can bring the others along, or whether you need to bring them along at all. The secret alliance between the Ottoman Empire and Germany was signed on August 2nd, 1914, 2 days before Britain entered the war. The same day, Germany declared war on Russia. It was negotiated by Enver Pasha and a small circle of CUP insiders, without the knowledge of most of the Ottoman cabinet, and without any kind of parliamentary oversight. The Grand Vizier, Said Halim Pasha, was involved. It was signed in his house, but several senior ministers were kept completely in the dark. This was not an accident. Enver knew that if the full cabinet debated it, the cautious voices would prevail. So he kept the circle small. The alliance was not, in itself, a declaration of war. It was a defensive pact. The Ottomans would enter the war if Germany's ally, Austria-Hungary, was attacked. Since Austria-Hungary was the aggressor in the crisis, it was the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia that had started the whole escalation. The logic seemed to offer some cover for delay. The Ottomans announced official neutrality and spent the next 3 months pretending to be neutral, while Enver systematically prepared for entry on the German side. The preparations were not entirely hidden. 2 German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, had been trapped in the Mediterranean by the British fleet and had taken refuge in the Bosphorus in August 1914. The Ottomans announced that they had purchased the ships, renamed them, and incorporated them into the Ottoman Navy. They kept the German crews. The German admiral in command, Wilhelm Souchon, was given nominal command of the Ottoman fleet. Britain demanded the German crews be sent home. The Ottomans declined. Britain was not pleased, but there was little it could do without starting the war it was hoping to avoid. On October 29, 1914, the Goeben and Breslau, still flying Ottoman flags, still crewed by Germans, sailed into the Black Sea and bombarded Russian ports, Sevastopol, Odessa, Feodosia. This was not an Ottoman cabinet decision. It was ordered by Enver Pasha and Admiral Souchon, without the knowledge of the Grand Vizier or most of the cabinet. Several ministers resigned in protest when they found out. Cemal Pasha was reportedly furious, but the deed was done. Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France followed. The Ottomans were in the war. What did Enver think he was going to get from this? That is genuinely worth examining, because it was not simply recklessness. It was recklessness built on a specific strategic vision that, in a different world, might not have been entirely crazy. Enver believed Germany would win the war quickly. The German military had promised a quick victory in the West, and many observers in 1914 agreed that a long war was unlikely. A quick German victory would mean the reorganization of Europe and the Middle East on German terms, and an Ottoman ally that had contributed meaningfully to that victory would be well positioned to reclaim lost territories and renegotiate its position in the world. Specifically, Enver had pan-Turkic dreams, a great Turkish empire stretching from Istanbul to Central Asia, uniting the Turkic-speaking peoples of the Caucasus and Central Asia under Ottoman leadership. A German victory over Russia would make this possible. Germany would get Western Europe. The Ottomans would get the Turkic world. Everyone wins. This vision was not unique to Enver. Pan-Turkism was a genuine ideological movement within the CUP and Ottoman intellectual circles, but Enver was its most committed champion and its most reckless operator. He genuinely believed in it. He was willing to stake the empire on it. And he was wrong in ways that became apparent almost immediately. The initial Ottoman military operations were a disaster. In December 1914, Enver personally commanded an offensive into the Caucasus, the Sarikamish campaign, aimed at striking into Russian-held territory and beginning the pan-Turkic expansion he dreamed of. He commanded 95,000 men into a winter mountain campaign with inadequate supplies, inadequate clothing, and tactically over-ambitious planning. By the end of January 1915, some 60,000 to 90,000 Ottoman soldiers were dead, most not from combat but from cold, starvation, and disease. It was one of the greatest military disasters in the history of a war that was full of military disasters. Enver returned to Istanbul and told no one what had really happened, instead blaming the defeat on Armenian disloyalty and treachery in the rear. That accusation, unsubstantiated, strategically convenient, and catastrophically dangerous, pointed directly toward the worst thing the empire did in the war. But before we get there, we need to understand what the war itself was doing to the Ottoman Empire on every front simultaneously, because the scale of the challenge was genuinely extraordinary. The Ottomans were fighting at various points on 5 fronts simultaneously: in the Caucasus against Russia, in the Sinai and Palestine against Britain, in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, against Britain, in the Dardanelles against Britain and France, in the campaign that became Gallipoli, and later in the Hejaz and Arabia against the Arab revolt that Britain helped to organize and fund. No empire with the Ottoman Empire's resources, already strained before the war began, could sustain that kind of multi-front commitment without catastrophic strain. The war killed hundreds of thousands of Ottoman soldiers and millions of Ottoman civilians through combat, disease, displacement, and deliberate violence. It consumed the treasury, disrupted the food supply, shattered the administrative apparatus, and accelerated every internal fracture the empire had been struggling to manage for a century. And then, in September and October 1918, the fronts collapsed. Allenby's cavalry broke through the Ottoman lines in Palestine with a speed that stunned everyone. Bulgarian collapse on the Macedonian front opened the route to Istanbul from the west. The Caucasus front disintegrated. On October 30th, 1918, Ottoman representatives signed the Armistice of Mudros aboard a British warship, a ceremony that, in its symbolism, could hardly have been more designed to humiliate. The Ottoman Empire was out of the war. Its armies had ceased to exist as functioning forces. Its German allies had surrendered. Its territory was occupied. Enver, Talat, and Cemal fled Istanbul on a German submarine on the night of November 2nd to 3rd, 1918, days after the armistice. They left behind a city under Allied occupation, a government in disarray, and a people who had suffered through 4 years of catastrophic war, mass atrocity, and total defeat. The 3 pashas would be tried in absentia by an Ottoman court-martial in 1919 and sentenced to death for their roles in the wartime atrocities and for leading the empire into a catastrophic war. Talat Pasha was assassinated in Berlin in 1921 by a survivor of the Armenian genocide. Enver died in 1922 in Central Asia, fighting the Bolsheviks in a last quixotic attempt to realize his pan-Turkic dreams. The dreams died with him. The empire they had led into disaster was still technically alive. The Sultan was still on his throne. The government was still functioning after a fashion. But the Allied powers were now deciding its fate, and what they decided would set the stage for one final, extraordinary convulsion. Chapter 7. The Great War destroys everything: genocide, Gallipoli, and the Arab revolt. You are an Armenian man. It is April 24th, 1915. You live in Istanbul. You are an intellectual, a journalist, a community leader, one of the estimated 235 Armenian community figures arrested tonight across Istanbul by Ottoman police acting on orders from Talat Pasha's interior ministry. Most of you will be dead within weeks. the community you leave behind. The Armenian population of Anatolia, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people, most of them living in the eastern provinces that border Russia, is about to face something that has no precedent in Ottoman history and few precedents in any history: systematic, organized, state-directed campaign of deportation and mass killing that will, by the time it ends, have eliminated the Armenian presence in Anatolia that had existed for thousands of years before the Ottomans arrived. The Armenian genocide is not a disputed historical event among scholars who study it. The debate about whether to call it a genocide, a term Turkey still officially rejects, is a political debate, not a historical one. Historians who have examined the evidence, the Ottoman archives that have become accessible since the 1980s, the German diplomatic records, the American consular reports, the survivor testimony, are in broad agreement. The deportation and mass killing of Armenians in 1915 and 1916 was systematic, centrally organized, and intended to eliminate the Armenian population from Anatolia. Estimates of the death toll range from 600,000 to 1.5 million people. The range reflects genuine uncertainty about the baseline population and the completeness of the killing records, not uncertainty about whether mass killing occurred. The CUP leadership's stated justification was military necessity. The Armenians, they claimed, were an enemy within, collaborating with Russia, supporting the Russian invasion of eastern Anatolia, threatening the empire from the rear while it was fighting for survival at the front. There was a kernel of truth in this claim. Some Armenian political organizations had cooperated with Russia, and there was an Armenian volunteer movement fighting on the Russian side that was inflated into a justification for collective punishment of the entire community, including women, children, and the elderly, who had no conceivable military role. The deportation orders issued in spring of 1915 directed the Armenian population of Anatolia to be removed from their homes and marched south toward the Syrian desert. The marches were death marches, not incidentally, but functionally. The deportees were given inadequate food and water. They were attacked by Kurdish irregular forces that the Interior Ministry had specifically organized and armed for the purpose. They were killed by special organization units, the Teshkilat-i Mahsusa, that had been created precisely to carry out operations the regular army could not officially conduct. Those who reached the Syrian desert were placed in camps without adequate shelter, food, or water, in conditions that killed many of those who had survived the march. Talat Pasha, who was the primary organizational architect of the deportations, reportedly said to the American ambassador Henry Morgenthau that the Armenian question had been settled. Morgenthau, who had heard the details directly from Talat and had been present in Istanbul throughout the worst of the killing, wrote a memoir afterward that is one of the most damning first-hand accounts of systematic atrocity in the historical record. He had begged Talat to stop. Talat had explained, with the candor he apparently felt he could afford with a foreign diplomat in private, that the decision had been made and would not be reversed. The genocide destroyed not only the Armenians of Anatolia, but also the multicultural character of the empire itself. The Ottoman Empire had for centuries been a space in which multiple religious and ethnic communities coexisted, imperfectly, unequally, with frequent violence and discrimination, but nonetheless in the same territory and under the same administration. The genocide was a declaration that this coexistence was over, that Anatolia was to be homogenized into a Turkish Muslim space, and that the communities that had inhabited it alongside the Turks for centuries were no longer welcome. The logic, once applied to the Armenians, would be applied to others, the Greek population of Anatolia, the Assyrian Christians, the Kurds, in the years that followed. Meanwhile, on the military fronts, the war continued its grinding destruction. Gallipoli, the Dardanelles campaign of 1915, was one of the few Ottoman military successes of the war, and it produced a general who would prove to be the most consequential figure in Ottoman and Turkish history since Suleiman the Magnificent. Mustafa Kemal was a CUP member and a capable officer who had been marginalized by Enver. The two men despised each other, but who found himself at Gallipoli in command of the division defending the Chunuk Bair Ridge when the Allied landings threatened to overwhelm the Ottoman positions. His leadership of the defense, specifically his famous order to his men that they were not to attack the enemy but to die, buying time for reinforcements, became the founding myth of modern Turkish military identity. The Allies were repulsed. Gallipoli became an Allied disaster and an Ottoman triumph, and Kemal became a hero, but Gallipoli was the exception. In Mesopotamia, a British force advancing on Baghdad was besieged at Kut al-Amara and surrendered in April 1916. One of the largest British surrenders since the American Revolution, and another moment of Ottoman military success. But the British reorganized, returned, and took Baghdad in 1917. In Palestine, the Ottoman forces were slowly pushed back by British and Commonwealth forces under General Allenby, who entered Jerusalem in December 1917 and had cleared most of Palestine by 1918. In the Arabian Peninsula, the Arab Revolt, launched in June 1916 by Sharif Hussein of Mecca, with British money and weapons and the organizational contribution of T.E. Lawrence, tied down Ottoman forces and eventually cut the Hejaz Railway that was the lifeline of Ottoman forces in Arabia. The Arab Revolt deserves a moment's attention because of what it meant symbolically, beyond its military significance. The Ottoman Sultan was the Caliph, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam. The Sharif of Mecca, the guardian of the holy cities, was revolting against him. This was not just a military problem, it was a religious crisis. The Kupi had tried to use Islamic solidarity to hold the empire together. Talat and Enver had declared jihad against the Entente powers in 1914, hoping to inspire Muslim uprisings in British India, French North Africa, and Russian Central Asia. That gambit largely failed. Muslim soldiers in the British and French armies did not lay down their arms in response to the Ottoman Jihad Declaration. And now the Arab Revolt demonstrated that Islamic solidarity ran only as far as shared interests, which was not far enough. By 1917, the empire was in desperate condition. The economy had collapsed. Inflation was destroying whatever purchasing power ordinary people had left. The food supply in major cities was unreliable. Conscription had stripped the countryside of its able-bodied men, leaving agricultural production in crisis. The treasury was empty. The empire was entirely dependent on German loans and German military support to continue fighting. Disease, typhus, cholera, malaria was killing soldiers faster than combat in many theaters. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had deserted. Civilian mortality from starvation and disease in some provinces was running at catastrophic rates. And then, in September and October 1918, the fronts collapsed. Allenby's cavalry broke through the Ottoman lines in Palestine with a speed that stunned everyone. Bulgarian collapse on the Macedonian front opened the route to Istanbul from the west. The Caucasus front disintegrated. On October 30th, 1918, Ottoman representatives signed the Armistice of Mudros aboard a British warship, for a ceremony that, in its symbolism, could hardly have been more designed to humiliate. The Ottoman Empire was out of the war. Its armies had ceased to exist as functioning forces. Its German allies had surrendered. Its territory was occupied. Enver, Talat, and Cemal fled Istanbul on a German submarine on the night of November 2nd to 3rd, 1918, days after the armistice. They left behind a city under Allied occupation, a government in disarray, and a people who had suffered through 4 years of catastrophic war, mass atrocity, and total defeat. Chapter 8. The Peace That Wasn't. The Treaty of Sèvres and the Partition of Everything You Are. A British Diplomat. It is August 1920. You are in the Palace of Versailles, specifically in the Trianon Palace at Sèvres, the porcelain town outside Paris, where the Allied powers have gathered to finalize what they intend to do with the Ottoman corpse. The empire has been defeated. Its army has collapsed. Its capital is under Allied occupation. The Sultan's government has signed whatever the Allies have put in front of it. And what you are putting in front of it today is one of the most comprehensive dismemberments of a state in modern history. The Treaty of Sèvres was the Allied powers' vision for what the Ottoman Empire would become after the war. And that vision was nothing. Not nothing in the sense of elimination. The Allies were not planning genocide. But nothing in the sense of sovereign territorial integrity. The treaty proposed to strip the Ottoman state of virtually everything except a rump Anatolia, and even that rump was to be carved up between spheres of influence, autonomous zones, and internationally administered territories that would leave the theoretical Ottoman sovereignty as theoretical as the legal independence of a colonial possession. The specific provisions of Sèvres were extraordinary in their comprehensiveness. The Arab territories, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, were already under British and French occupation and would be formalized as League of Nations mandates. Syria and Lebanon to France, Iraq and Palestine to Britain. This was not a surprise. It was the implementation of the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, the secret deal between Britain and France to divide the Ottoman Arab territories between themselves, drawn with the specific casualness of the colonial administrator who draws lines on maps without reference to the people living on either side of those lines. Eastern Anatolia was to be partitioned between an independent Armenian state and an expanded Kurdish autonomous zone. The Hejaz, the Arabian Peninsula, was to be independent. Greece was to receive Eastern Thrace, and most explosively, a zone of administration around the city of Smyrna, Izmir, on the Anatolian coast, with the right to petition for annexation after 5 years. The Straits, the Bosphorus, and the Dardanelles were to be internationally administered, controlled, by a commission that included the Allied powers, but not effectively the Ottoman government, whose capital sat on either side of them. The Ottoman military was to be reduced to a constabulary force of 50,000 men. The Ottoman economy was to be placed under Allied financial supervision. The man who signed this treaty on behalf of the Ottoman government was signing the death warrant of the Ottoman state as a meaningful entity. The Sultan's government signed it because it had no choice. The Allies had the guns, the ships, and the occupation forces, and the Sultan's government was operating in an occupied capital under Allied pressure. But the signing of the Sèvres Treaty did not mean it would be implemented, because while the Sultan's government was signing documents in Paris, something was happening in Anatolia that the Allied powers had not adequately anticipated, and that would make the entire Sèvres settlement obsolete before the ink had dried. The resistance was already organizing, and its leader was the man who had defended Gallipoli. Chapter 9. The man from Salonika, Mustafa Kemal, and the War of Independence. You are Mustafa Kemal. It is May 19th, 1919. You have just arrived in the Black Sea port of Samsun on the Anatolian coast, nominally as an inspector for the Ottoman army, sent by the Sultan's government to oversee the demobilization of remaining Ottoman forces in the region. That is the official story. The real story is different. You have been watching the Allied occupation of Istanbul, watching the Sultan's government sign whatever the Allies demand, watching Greek forces land at Smyrna with Allied blessing and begin advancing into the Anatolian interior. And you have decided that this is not acceptable. The empire may be dead, but something can be saved from its wreckage. Something has to be. Mustafa Kemal was, by any measure, one of the most consequential human beings of the 20th century. He was born in Salonika, which is now Thessaloniki in Greece, then a cosmopolitan Ottoman city that had been lost in the Balkan Wars, in 1881. He was educated in military schools, emerged as a capable officer, distinguished himself at Gallipoli, served on multiple fronts in the First World War, and spent most of the war in a state of barely concealed fury at Enver Pasha's incompetence and the Cup's disastrous strategic decisions. He had opposed the German alliance. He had opposed the Gallipoli offensive's initial planning. He had been right, repeatedly, about things that the people actually in power were catastrophically wrong about, and had been systematically ignored because Enver despised him, and the QP found him difficult. Now, in the wreckage of 1919, with Enver fled, and the Cuyp dissolved, and the empire prostrate, Kemal was the man who had the combination of qualities that the moment required: military credibility, political intelligence, organizational capacity, and an absolute clarity of purpose that cut through the confusion and despair of the post-war situation with the specific force of the person who knows exactly what he is doing and why. What he was doing was building a national resistance movement from the ruins of the Ottoman army. He organized a congress at Sivas in September 1919 that produced the National Pact, the specific statement of the minimum territorial demands that the Turkish nationalist movement would accept, essentially the borders of the Anatolian heartland, excluding the Arab territories, but including significant portions of eastern Thrace. He built a parallel government in Ankara, a small, dusty Anatolian city far from the Allied guns of Istanbul, that gradually supplanted the authority of the Sultan's government in the interior. He organized the remaining Ottoman military units, the irregular forces, and the local resistance groups into the Turkish National Forces, which would become the core of the new Turkish army. The Sultan's government, under Allied pressure, declared Kemal a traitor. The Allied powers assumed that the nationalist movement was a temporary irritation that would collapse when confronted with serious military pressure. Both of these assessments proved wrong. The Greek invasion was the specific military challenge that crystallized the resistance. In May 1919, with Allied blessing, Greek forces had landed at Smyrna and begun advancing into the Anatolian interior. The Greek Prime Minister, Eleftherios Venizelos, had a vision, the Megali idea, the great idea, of recreating a Greek empire centered on Constantinople and incorporating the Aegean coast of Anatolia, which had large Greek populations. The Allied powers, particularly Lloyd George in Britain, were sympathetic to Greek claims and had authorized the Smyrna landing. The Greek advance into Anatolia was initially successful. The depleted, disorganized remnants of the Ottoman forces could not effectively resist a well-equipped Greek army backed by Allied naval power. But Kemal was building his forces and his organizational capacity faster than the Allies expected, and the Greeks were advancing into a hostile interior that resented their presence in the specific violent way of populations encountering an enemy occupation. The war between the Turkish nationalist forces and the Greek army, the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, was the specific military conflict that determined what Turkey would be. It was brutal on both sides. Atrocities were committed by both Greek and Turkish forces. Villages were burned. Populations were expelled or massacred. The specific violence of the ethnic cleansing that had begun in the Balkan Wars continued in this new form, with the same logic of creating homogeneous national territories by eliminating the people who complicated the picture. The military tide turned. In 1921, Kemal reorganized the Turkish forces, brought in capable commanders, secured supplies from the Soviet Union, which had its own reasons for wanting to weaken the Allied position in the region, and launched the counteroffensive that would determine the war's outcome. The Battle of Sakarya in August to September 1921 was the turning point, a 22-day engagement in which the Turkish forces halted the Greek offensive and then drove it back. After Sakarya, the strategic momentum shifted decisively. In August 1922, Kemal launched the Great Offensive, the final push that broke the Greek lines and drove the Greek army to the sea in a matter of weeks. The Greek army collapsed with the same speed that the Ottoman army had collapsed in the Balkan Wars, a mirror image of the humiliation that had shaped Kemal's own political formation. The Turkish cavalry reached the Aegean coast. The Greek and Armenian populations of Smyrna, the cosmopolitan, prosperous port city that had been one of the jewels of the Anatolian coast, fled in a catastrophe. The city burned. Tens of thousands died or drowned, attempting to reach the Allied ships that were watching from the harbor. The Smyrna catastrophe was the specific final act of the ethnic cleansing of Anatolia, the elimination of the Greek and Armenian communities that had existed in the region for thousands of years before the Turks arrived. The military victory was total, and with it, the Sèvres settlement was dead. The Allies who had designed it were confronting the specific problem of a defeated power that had refused to stay defeated. Chapter 10. The Sultan in the Ambulance. How the Ottoman institution itself was abolished. You are Mehmed VI. It is November 1922. You are the 36th and last Ottoman Sultan, and you are leaving. The specific humiliation of your departure is exquisite in its thoroughness. Mustafa Kemal's Grand National Assembly in Ankara has just voted to abolish the Sultanate. Not the Caliphate, not yet, but the political institution of the Ottoman Sultanate that your family has held for 600 years. The vote was not close. The announcement was not made to you personally before it was made publicly. You learned, as the city learned, that you were no longer Sultan through the announcement that Kemal's government made to the world. Your options are limited. You can stay in Istanbul and become a figurehead without the title, subject to whatever Kemal's government decides to do with you. And the historical record of what revolutionary nationalist governments do with the monarchs of the states they have replaced is not encouraging. Or you can leave. You choose to leave. The British, who have the warships, and the diplomatic interest in not having the last Ottoman Sultan publicly humiliated beyond the point that might create a martyr, offer to take you out quietly. Hence the ambulance. Hence the 6 a.m. departure. Hence the single glance back at the palace before the ambulance turns the corner. The abolition of the Sultanate was not an accident. It was the specific, deliberate decision of Kemal's movement to end the Ottoman institution rather than reform it, to break cleanly from the imperial past rather than build the new Turkey on its foundation. The decision was made in the specific context of the peace negotiations that followed the military victory, when the Allies invited both the Ankara government and the Istanbul government to the conference at Lausanne that would replace the Sèvres settlement with a negotiated peace. Kemal's response to the dual invitation was the abolition of the Sultanate, which ended the Istanbul government's claim to represent anything. There would be one Turkish negotiating team at Lausanne, and it would be his. The Ankara Grand National Assembly voted to abolish the Sultanate on November 1st, 1922. Mehmed VI left on November 17. The Ottoman Empire, as a political institution, as a ruling dynasty, as a legal entity, was over. The Caliphate survived briefly. Kemal allowed the appointment of a new caliph. Mehmed VI's cousin, Abdülmecid II, who would hold the religious office without the political one. This was a transitional arrangement, a concession to the Islamic world's attachment to the caliphal institution that Kemal was not yet ready to confront directly. It lasted less than 2 years. In March 1924, the Grand National Assembly abolished the caliphate as well. Abdülmecid was sent into exile with 3 hours' notice and a small amount of money. The office that had been held by the Ottoman sultans since the conquest of Egypt in 1517. The spiritual leadership of Sunni Islam that had given the Ottoman ruler his claim to universal Muslim authority was ended by a parliamentary vote in Ankara. The specific manner of the caliphate's abolition tells you everything about what Kemal was building. He was not building a reformed Ottoman state. He was not building an Islamic republic. He was building a Turkish national state, explicitly secular in its constitutional framework, consciously modeled on the European nation-state rather than the Islamic empire. The caliphate was incompatible with this vision. It was the specifically Ottoman, specifically Islamic institution that tied the Turkish state to an imperial and religious past that Kemal was determined to break from. The Islamic world reacted to the abolition of the caliphate with the specific dismay of the community whose central political institution had just been eliminated by a unilateral vote of a national parliament. Various proposals were made for reviving the caliphate under different leadership. In Egypt, in Arabia, in India, none of them succeeded. The caliphate has not been revived in any form that the broader Muslim community recognizes in the century since. The specific consequences of that absence, the lack of a central religious political authority in Sunni Islam, the proliferation of competing claims to Islamic leadership, are still reverberating through the 21st century's religious and political landscape. Chapter 11. Lausanne, the peace that actually stuck and why it was so brutal. The negotiations at Lausanne were not the negotiations at Versailles. At Versailles, the defeated powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, had been presented with peace terms and told to sign. There had been no negotiation. There had been complaints, modifications in some details, and ultimately, signatures obtained under duress. The humiliation of the process was part of its political consequence. The sense among the defeated populations that the peace had been imposed rather than agreed was one of the specific structural resentments that the subsequent decades exploited. Lausanne was different. The Turkish delegation at Lausanne, led by İsmet İnönü, Kemal's capable and tenacious foreign minister, was not negotiating from a position of defeat. It was negotiating from a position of military victory. The Turkish army had just expelled the Greek forces from Anatolia. The Sèvres settlement was dead. The Allies needed a new agreement, and they needed it with a Turkey that had demonstrated it was capable of fighting, rather than just signing whatever was presented to it. The negotiations were consequently real negotiations, contentious, prolonged, occasionally breaking down and resuming, with the Allies unable to simply impose their preferred terms and the Turks unable to simply ignore Allied interests. İnönü negotiated with extraordinary skill and patience, grinding down Allied positions over months of argument, while Kemal provided the political backing that allowed the delegation to hold firm when the Allies applied pressure. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in July 1923, was the result. It established the borders of the modern Turkish Republic, borders that have remained essentially stable for a century, which is a remarkable achievement in a region that has seen extraordinary instability. It recognized Turkish sovereignty over Anatolia and eastern Thrace. It ended the capitulations, the extraterritorial privileges that European nationals had enjoyed in Ottoman territory for centuries. It established the framework for the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, the forced transfer of approximately 1.5 million Greek Orthodox Christians from Anatolia and 500,000 Muslims from Greece that was one of the largest forced population movements in European history. The population exchange was brutal by any measure. People who had lived in their communities for generations, Greeks whose families had been in Anatolia for 2,000 years, Muslims whose families had been in Greece since the Ottoman conquest, were uprooted, their property confiscated or abandoned, their communities dissolved, their identities redefined by the religion that the exchange used as its criterion rather than the language or culture that the individuals themselves might have considered primary. Greek-speaking Muslims from Crete went to Turkey. Turkish-speaking Orthodox Christians from Anatolia went to Greece. Both groups arrived in countries that were nominal homelands, but felt to many of the arrivals like foreign places. But the exchange achieved its brutal purpose. After Lausanne, the specific ethnic and religious mixing that had characterized the Ottoman Anatolian world for centuries was gone. Turkey was overwhelmingly Muslim and predominantly Turkish-speaking. Greece was overwhelmingly Orthodox Christian and predominantly Greek-speaking. The population exchange eliminated, at enormous human cost, the demographic complexity that had been the specific source of the territorial disputes and the ethnic violence of the previous decade. The specific achievement of Lausanne, a peace agreement that actually resolved the conflict it was supposed to resolve, that produced stable borders that persisted for a century, stands in instructive contrast to the other post-First World War settlements in the Middle East. The mandates system that created modern Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine did not produce stable arrangements. It produced borders drawn for imperial convenience, states without coherent national identities, and political arrangements that the populations subject to them resented and eventually overturned through decades of violence. The contrast between Turkey's Lausanne borders and Iraq's Sykes-Picot borders is the contrast between a settlement negotiated with the participation of the people it affected and a settlement imposed on them. Chapter 12. The Republic. What Kemal built on the Ottoman rubble and why it was so radical. The Republic was proclaimed on October the 29th, 1923. Kemal stood before the Grand National Assembly in Ankara and announced that the Turkish state, reconstituted on the territory that the Lausanne Treaty had confirmed, was henceforth a republic. He was elected its first president by the assembly. İnönü became prime minister. Ankara, the small Anatolian city that had been the center of the resistance and the seat of the nationalist government, became the permanent capital of the new state, deliberately bypassing Istanbul and its Ottoman associations. The specific choice of Ankara over Istanbul was the spatial expression of the entire Kemalist project. Istanbul was the Ottoman city, the city of the sultans and the caliphs, and the great mosques, and the Topkapi Palace, and the Byzantine heritage, and the cosmopolitan trading culture that the empire had produced. It was also the city most exposed to Western influence, most associated with the compromised Ottoman government that had signed Sèvres, most freighted with the specific history that Kemal was determined to break from. Ankara was a new capital for a new state, deliberately, symbolically new, chosen precisely because it carried none of the imperial associations that Istanbul carried. What Kemal built over the next 15 years, he died in 1938, having served as president from 1923 until his death, was the most radical transformation of a major state since the French Revolution. He abolished not just the Sultanate and the Caliphate, but the entire institutional framework of the Ottoman religious order. The religious courts were replaced by secular civil courts using the Swiss Civil Code. The religious schools were placed under state control and eventually closed or transformed. The Sufi orders, the dervish brotherhoods that had been central to Ottoman spiritual and social life for centuries, were outlawed. The Arabic script, in which Ottoman Turkish had been written for centuries, was replaced by a Latin alphabet, severing the literate connection to the Ottoman past with the specific efficiency of the reform that made the old script literally unreadable to anyone educated in the new one. The Hat Law of 1925 required Turkish men to wear Western-style hats rather than the fez, a piece of apparently trivial legislation that was anything but trivial. The fez was the specific Ottoman symbol that Kemal had decided to eliminate, and the resistance to the hat law in some conservative parts of Anatolia was violent enough to require military suppression and judicial executions. The specific fury that a law about headwear provoked, and the specific determination with which Kemal enforced it, tells you everything about what was at stake. This was not a law about hats. It was a law about identity, about which version of Turkey would exist, about whether the revolution was real or merely cosmetic. The legal emancipation of women was another Kemalist reform of genuine significance. Turkish women received the right to vote in 1930, before women in France, Italy, or Switzerland. Women were admitted to universities. Women entered the professions, the military, the civil service. The specific visibility of women in public life without the veil. Kemal publicly discouraged veiling as a symbol of the old order, though he did not legally ban it for most of his tenure, was itself a statement about what Turkey was becoming. The economic transformation was more mixed. Kemal was a nationalist in economics as in politics, and the statist economic model he built, with the state controlling major industries, building railways and factories through state enterprises, directing investment toward the goals that the government identified, produced genuine development, but also the specific inefficiencies of the state-directed economy. Turkey in 1938 was genuinely different from Turkey in 1923. More urbanized, more industrialized, more literate, more connected by roads and railways. But the development had been purchased at the cost of political authoritarianism and economic distortion that the subsequent generations would have to manage. Kemal's relationship with democracy was the relationship of the revolutionary who believes in the destination, but not yet in the population's readiness to choose it. The Turkish state under Kemal was a one-party state. The Republican People's Party was the only political party, and political opposition was not permitted. The press was controlled. Political opponents were arrested, exiled, Or, in the case of former Kupi associates and independence-era allies who had become rivals, tried and executed, the specific methods of the Kemalist state were the methods of the authoritarian nationalist project, and the justification was always the same. The reforms were necessary. The population was not yet ready for genuine democratic choice. The opposition was reactionary and would undo the progress that had been achieved. This justification, the standard justification of the modernizing authoritarian, contained genuine elements of truth alongside the self-serving rationalization that the exercise of unchecked power always produces. The reforms were necessary in some of their dimensions. The opposition did include genuinely reactionary elements that would have reversed significant achievements. And Kemal was also a politician protecting his own power, an autocrat who had developed the specific habits of the man who has never had to accept the outcome of an election he lost. The Turkey he built survived him. His successor, İnönü, navigated the Second World War with a specific, careful neutrality that kept Turkey out of a conflict that would have destroyed the young republic. Democratic elections were introduced in 1946. The opposition party won in 1950. Power changed hands peacefully. The specific achievement that the Kemalist state, for all its authoritarianism, had built the institutional infrastructure to enable when the moment came. Chapter 13. The Inheritance. What the Arab world got from the Ottoman collapse, and why it is still unresolved. The lines were drawn in London, not in the Arab world, not by the people who lived on either side of them, not by the tribal leaders whose communities the lines would bisect, not by the farmers whose fields the lines would cut through, not by the city merchants whose trading networks the lines would interrupt. The lines were drawn in London and Paris, in the specific rooms where the British and French diplomats met to divide between themselves the Arab territories that the Ottoman collapse had left available. And the specific quality of the lines they drew was the quality of the lines drawn by people who were looking at maps rather than landscapes, at strategic interests rather than human communities, at the future empires they intended to build rather than the societies they were proposing to govern. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, named for Sir Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France, the two diplomats who negotiated it, was the specific document that defined the post-Ottoman Arab world's political geography. It was secret. It was drawn without reference to the Arab populations it concerned. It directly contradicted the promises that Britain had made to Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the promises of Arab independence in exchange for the Arab revolt's contribution to the war against the Ottomans. It also directly contradicted the promises implied in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which committed Britain to supporting a Jewish homeland in Palestine, while supposedly protecting Arab rights there. The specific geography that Sykes-Picot produced was the geography of the imperial convenience rather than the political coherence. The lines that became the borders of Iraq incorporated three former Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, whose populations were Kurdish in the north, Sunni Arab in the center, and Shia Arab in the south, and whose combination into a single state was the combination of three communities with fundamentally different interests, histories, and political orientations into a political entity that none of them had chosen and none of them was particularly committed to. The Iraq that the British Mandate created was an Iraq held together by the specific mechanisms of colonial administration, the appointed king, the British-trained army, the administrative apparatus of the imperial state, and the specific violence of the colonial power, willing to use air bombardment to suppress tribal uprisings, as the RAF did in the 1920s, with the specific cost-effective brutality of the colonial administrator who has discovered that aircraft are cheaper than ground troops. When the British Mandate ended and the specific mechanisms of colonial administration were removed, Iraq discovered that the political entity it had been told it was didn't correspond to any community of interest that its population recognized. The same logic applied to Syria, to Lebanon, to Palestine, to the various other political entities that the mandate system assembled from the Ottoman wreckage. Syria's borders incorporated communities: Druze, Alawites, Sunni Arabs, Armenians, Kurds, whose political interests were not served by the specific borders the French drew. Lebanon's borders incorporated the specific Lebanese territories, plus the surrounding regions that the French added to give the Lebanese Christian community the majority in a larger state, creating the specific demographic arithmetic of Lebanese politics that would eventually produce the Lebanese Civil War. Palestine's borders incorporated the specific territory that the competing Jewish and Arab nationalisms both claimed as their own, creating the specific conflict that has not been resolved in the century since. The Ottoman Empire had governed all of these territories for 4 centuries. Its governance was not benign. It was the governance of an imperial power with its own interests, its own biases, its own methods of extraction and control, but it had governed them as a single connected system, with the specific administrative coherence of the imperial bureaucracy that knew where the roads went and where the water came from, and which tribes were in which valleys, and what the specific local political arrangements were that kept the peace in each particular district. The mandate system replaced this specific, accumulated administrative knowledge with the specific ignorance of the new colonial administrator, who arrived with a theory about how to govern and a map that showed the borders rather than the people. The consequences of this replacement are the consequences that the Arab world has been living with for a century. The failed states, the civil wars, the sectarian conflicts, the authoritarian governments that held the artificial states together through the specific methods of the regime that understands it cannot govern by consent and therefore governs by force. This is not to romanticize the Ottoman period. The Ottoman Arabs were not free. They were not equal. The Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire were governed by Turkish-speaking administrators from Istanbul, who extracted tax revenue and conscripted soldiers, and managed the Arabs as subjects rather than citizens. The Arab nationalist movement that emerged in the late Ottoman period was a genuine response to genuine grievances. The desire for autonomy, for recognition of Arab culture and language, for the specific political dignity of the people who had been told for centuries that their language and culture were secondary to the imperial language and culture of the Ottomans. But the Arab nationalist movement's vision, the unified Arab state, or the Federation of Arab States that would emerge from the Ottoman collapse and give the Arab world the political coherence that the nationalists believed its cultural unity warranted, was not what the mandate system produced. What the mandate system produced was the specific, fragmented, externally administered set of states that served British and French imperial interests rather than Arab political aspirations, and the specific resentment that this produced has been one of the defining features of Arab political culture for a century. The Ottoman Empire did not create the Arab world's problems, but its collapse and the specific manner of the post-Ottoman settlement created the political framework within which those problems have been experienced and expressed ever since. Chapter 14. The Genocide's Long Shadow. Why the Armenian question has never been resolved, and what that means the denial has outlasted the empire that committed the act. This is the specific, extraordinary fact about the Armenian genocide's place in the political history of the region, that the Ottoman Empire, which committed the genocide, no longer exists, but the denial of the genocide has persisted through the successor state, through a century of Turkish Republican politics, through the specific institutional, diplomatic, and political decisions of the Turkish state that has made the denial of the genocide a matter of official policy and national identity. The denial is not a minor political position in Turkey. It is embedded in the criminal code. Article 301 of the Turkish Penal Code makes it an offense to insult Turkishness, a provision that has been used to prosecute writers and journalists who have publicly acknowledged the genocide. It is embedded in the diplomatic relationships. Turkey has withdrawn ambassadors and threatened trade relationships with countries that have officially recognized the genocide. It is embedded in the educational system. Turkish school children are taught a version of the 1915 events that attributes the Armenian deaths to war, disease, banditry, and Armenian collaboration with Russia, rather than to the systematic state-directed campaign of deportation and mass killing that the historical record documents. The specific political logic of the denial is understandable, even if the denial itself is not defensible. The Turkish national identity that Kemal built was built partly in opposition to the Ottoman past. The empire was corrupt, backward, theocratic, the specific historical failure that the Republic had replaced with something modern and progressive. But the genocide was committed by the Theop, the same organization from which many of the Republic's founders had emerged, the same generation of young Turks whose political formation shaped the men who built the Turkish state. Acknowledging the genocide would require acknowledging that the founders of the Republic were associated with one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century, and the specific political difficulty of that acknowledgement has been greater than the Turkish state has been willing to manage. The international recognition of the genocide has been slow and politically complicated. Countries recognize it when recognition serves their political interests and delay recognition when it conflicts with them. The United States recognized the Armenian genocide in 2021, over a century after the events, and after decades of specifically not recognizing it because Turkey was a NATO ally whose cooperation was more immediately valuable than the historical justice that recognition represented. France recognized it in 2001. Germany, the ally of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, whose diplomats sent dispatches to Berlin describing what they witnessed, recognized it in 2016. Turkey has responded to each recognition with the specific diplomatic anger of the state that treats the historical question as an existential threat rather than a historical judgment. Ambassadors have been recalled. Trade relationships have been threatened. The specific pattern: recognition, Turkish anger, diplomatic difficulty, followed by the gradual normalization of the relationship, has repeated itself enough times that its specific choreography is now entirely predictable. The Armenian diaspora, the descendants of the survivors who fled to France, to the United States, to Russia, to Syria and Lebanon, to wherever they could reach, has maintained the specific sustained collective memory of the genocide that the communities in Anatolia were unable to maintain because those communities were destroyed. April 24th. The date in 1915 when the Ottoman authorities arrested the Armenian community leaders in Istanbul is commemorated annually by the Armenian diaspora worldwide as Genocide Remembrance Day. It is the specific annual assertion of the historical memory that the Turkish state has spent a century attempting to suppress. The specific human cost of the genocide's unacknowledged status is not only the injustice to the Armenian community, the denial of the recognition that historical justice requires. It is also the cost to the political cultures that maintain the denial. The Turkish society that cannot honestly discuss 1915 is the Turkish society that has a specific, unresolved wound in its national narrative. A wound that cannot heal because it cannot be acknowledged. The specific writers and journalists who have been prosecuted for acknowledging the genocide. Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist, who was tried under Article 301 for saying in a Swiss newspaper that 30,000 Kurds and 1 million Armenians had been killed on these lands, are the specific individuals who have paid the personal cost of the political economy of denial. The resolution of the Armenian question, whatever resolution eventually comes, will require Turkey to do something that no government in its history has been willing to do: acknowledge honestly to its own people and to the world what happened in 1915 and what the state's role in it was. That acknowledgement has not come. Whether it will come and what form it will take when it does is one of the open questions of the 21st century's engagement with the 20th century's worst crimes. Chapter 15. The Legacy in Europe. How the Ottoman collapse shaped the Balkans, shaped nationalism, and echoes in wars. We thought were over. The wars of the 1990s were Ottoman wars, not in the sense that the Ottoman Empire caused them. The empire had been gone for 70 years when the Yugoslav wars began, but in the sense that the specific ethnic and religious geography of the former Yugoslavia, the specific distribution of Catholic Croats and Orthodox Serbs and Muslim Bosniaks and Kosovo Albanians across the territory of the former Yugoslavia, was the demographic inheritance of the Ottoman period, and the specific nationalisms that mobilized those communities into genocidal violence in the 1990s were the nationalisms that had been forming since the Ottoman period and had been accumulating their specific grievances and their specific mythologies for a century. The Kosovo Polje, the Field of the Blackbirds, where the Ottoman army defeated the Serbian coalition in 1389, was the specific site of the founding myth of Serbian nationalism. The medieval Serbian state had been destroyed at Kosovo. The Ottoman Empire had governed the Serbs for 5 centuries. The Albanian Muslims of Kosovo, who had converted to Islam during the Ottoman period and had occupied the territory for centuries, were the specific demographic presence in the land of the Serbian founding myth. In 1989, at the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, Slobodan Milošević gave a speech at the Kosovo Polje that mobilized Serbian nationalism against the Albanian population of Kosovo, with the specific, deliberate deployment of the Ottoman-era mythology. The Ottoman period's legacy in the Balkans was not only the demographic complexity that the Ottoman administration had created and the subsequent nationalisms exploited. It was also the specific institutional inheritance of the millet system, the Ottoman practice of governing religious communities as semi-autonomous corporate bodies, which had preserved the religious and cultural identities of the Balkan communities through 5 centuries of Ottoman rule. The Serbs were still Orthodox, the Bosniaks were Muslim, the Croats were Catholic. The specific religious identities that the Millet system had maintained were the identities that the subsequent nationalisms mobilized into the ethnic categories that the 20th century made so lethal. The Bosnian War of 1992 to 1995 was the war in which the Bosniak Muslim community, the descendants of the Slavic converts to Islam who had converted during the Ottoman period, was subjected to the specific campaign of ethnic cleansing and genocide that the Serbian nationalist project identified as the necessary precondition for the Greater Serbia that the collapse of Yugoslavia seemed to make possible. The Srebrenica massacre of July 1995, in which Bosniak men and boys were systematically murdered by Bosnian Serb forces while Dutch UN peacekeepers watched, was the worst atrocity in Europe since the Second World War and the specific culmination of the nationalist project that had been building since the Ottoman period. The specific irony of the Balkan nationalism that produced these wars is the irony of the nationalisms that formed in opposition to the Ottoman Empire and then replicated in their own projects of ethnic homogenization the specific logic of the violence that the Ottoman Empire had itself deployed in its terminal period. The Serbian ethnic cleansing of Kosovo and Bosnia was the specific method of the Armenian genocide applied to a different population in a different context. The elimination of the demographic complexity that complicated the nationalist project by removing the people who complicated it. The Ottoman inheritance in Europe is not only the inheritance of the violence, it is also the inheritance of the cultural exchange, the specific centuries-long coexistence of Orthodox, Catholic, and Muslim communities in the same geographic space that produced the specific, complex, layered cultures of the Balkans that the violence of the 20th century was unable to entirely destroy. The food, the music, the architecture, the specific vocabulary of hospitality and coffee culture that the Balkan countries share with Turkey and the broader former Ottoman world. These are the positive inheritances of the Ottoman period, the specific cultural contributions of 5 centuries of shared administration. The coffee house, the hammam, the specific vocabulary of the Ottoman administrative and commercial world that has entered every Balkan language. These are the Ottoman inheritance that the nationalist projects did not manage to eliminate because they were too deeply embedded in the daily life of the communities that the nationalisms were mobilizing. The Balkan nationalist who hated the Ottomans drank his coffee from a cup whose specific form had arrived with the Ottomans, in a coffee house whose specific institution the Ottomans had introduced, using the specific word for coffee, kahve, cafe, kava, in the various Balkan languages, that the Ottoman period had deposited in every language of the region. The Ottoman Empire is 500 years in the past in some parts of the Balkans. It is 30 years in the past in the specific political sense of the wars that its legacy helped to produce. It is present today in the specific, ongoing political negotiations over Kosovo's independence, over Bosnia's constitutional arrangements, over the specific, unresolved territorial and demographic questions that the Ottoman period created and that the subsequent century has not resolved. Chapter 16. The question of inevitability. Could the Ottoman Empire have been saved? And does the answer matter? The empire did not have to die the way it died. This is the specific, important distinction that the history of the Ottoman fall requires making clearly before the conclusion. The distinction between the end of the Ottoman Empire as a great power, which was probably inevitable given the structural pressures it faced, and the specific manner of the end, which was not inevitable, and which produced consequences that a different end would not have produced. The structural pressures were real and serious. The military revolution in Europe had opened a gap in military technology and organizational capacity that the Ottomans struggled to close. The Industrial Revolution had opened an economic gap that the Ottomans found even harder to address. The nationalism that transformed the political logic of the European state system, from dynastic empires governing diverse populations to nation-states claiming to represent ethnically and culturally homogeneous communities, was structurally incompatible with the Ottoman model of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire governed by a Muslim dynasty and a bureaucratic elite. These were not problems that a cleverer sultan or a more capable reform program could have simply solved. They were the structural conditions of the 19th century world, and they bore on the Ottoman Empire with the specific weight of forces that are larger than any individual decision. But structural forces do not determine specific outcomes. They create pressures within which specific decisions are made, and those decisions determine the specific form that the structural pressures take. The Tanzimat could have gone further. The 1876 Constitution might have survived if Abdul Hamid had been less paranoid, or the 1877-78 war had ended differently. The Young Turks could have maintained the Ottomanism of their original program, rather than hardening into Turkish nationalism. The German alliance was a specific choice, made by specific men in specific circumstances, not the inevitable product of the structural situation. The Armenian genocide was a specific decision made by specific people, not the automatic consequence of the war. The Sykes-Picot borders were specific choices made by specific diplomats, not the necessary outcome of the Ottoman collapse. The counterfactual history of the Ottoman Empire is genuinely interesting, precisely because there were so many specific moments where specific different decisions might have produced different outcomes. What if the 1876 Constitution had been maintained and the parliamentary system allowed to develop? The Ottoman parliament had genuine diversity: Turkish, Arab, Greek, Armenian, Jewish representatives debating legislation together. A constitutional system that gave the empire's communities genuine representation and genuine stakes in the empire's survival might have been more resilient than the autocracy that replaced it. The specific problems of the Balkan nationalist movements might have been more manageable within a constitutional framework that gave them political voice. What if the Ottomans had stayed out of the First World War? The neutrality option was genuinely available in 1914. It was what most of the cabinet wanted. It was what the political logic of a weakened empire should have recommended. And it was what Kemal himself believed the empire should have chosen. A neutral Ottoman Empire might have survived the war and its aftermath in a weakened but functioning form. The Armenian genocide would not have happened because the genocide's specific justification, the wartime emergency, the military necessity, the Armenian collaboration with Russia, was inseparable from the specific context of the Ottoman war effort. The specific post-war settlement might have been more favorable to an empire that had not been defeated. The question of inevitability matters not as historical speculation, but as historical understanding. The Ottoman fall produced the world we live in. The specific borders, the specific conflicts, the specific unresolved questions of the Middle East and the Balkans that shape the contemporary political landscape. Understanding that this world was not the inevitable product of impersonal forces, but the specific product of specific decisions, allows us to understand it as the contingent result of human choices, rather than the necessary consequence of historical destiny. And that understanding is the specific important understanding that makes the history of the Ottoman fall more than the story of an empire's death. It makes it the story of how the world we inhabit came to be, and why it might have been different. The empire did not have to die the way it died. The world it left behind did not have to be the world it is. Both of these things are true, and both of them matter. Chapter 17. The Ghost. Why the Ottoman Empire keeps returning, and what that tells us about history that refuses to stay. Past the empire keeps coming back. Not literally. The Sultanate has not been restored. The Caliphate has not been revived. The Topkapi Palace remains a museum rather than a seat of government. But the Ottoman Empire keeps returning in the specific sense of the historical presence that will not stay in the past, that keeps inserting itself into the present tense of the political, cultural, and diplomatic arguments of the 21st century in ways that the empire's historical distance would not lead you to predict. It returns in Turkey, the specific dramatic shift in Turkish political culture over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the rise of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the AKP, the party that drew its political energy from the conservative Islamic tradition that Kemalism had marginalized. The gradual dismantling of the specifically Kemalist institutional framework of the secular republic has been accompanied by a specific deliberate rehabilitation of the Ottoman past as a source of national pride and political inspiration. The Ottoman sultans, who were written out of the Kemalist national narrative as the backward rulers of a decadent empire, have been written back in as the heroic founders of a great civilization whose legacy the modern Turkish state is entitled to claim and to project. The television series Dirilish, Ertuğrul, the enormously popular Turkish drama about the father of Osman, the founder of the Ottoman dynasty, is the specific cultural artifact that this rehabilitation has produced at its most commercially successful. The series, which ran for 5 seasons from 2014 to 2019, attracted audiences across the Muslim world from Pakistan to Malaysia to the Arab states, in the specific way of the cultural product that touches the collective memory of communities that share the Ottoman historical inheritance. It is, in its way, a remarkable cultural phenomenon. The historical drama of a medieval Turkish warrior resonating with contemporary Muslim audiences from Morocco to Indonesia. And its resonance is the resonance of the Ottoman period as the specific moment of Muslim political and cultural greatness that the subsequent centuries of colonialism and fragmentation have not repeated. Erdogan's foreign policy has been described by critics as neo-Ottoman. The specific attempt to project Turkish influence into the territories of the former Ottoman Empire, to position Turkey as the natural leader of the Sunni Muslim world, to use the Ottoman historical legacy as the diplomatic and cultural capital of a regional power, aspiring to a larger role. The specific interventions in Libya, in Syria, in Somalia, in Qatar, the specific diplomatic and military presence that Turkey has built in the former Ottoman spaces of the Middle East and Africa, are the specific contemporary expression of the argument that Turkey is not merely a Balkan state on the edge of Europe, but the heir of an imperial tradition that gives it a special relationship with the Muslim world beyond its borders. This neo-Ottoman framing is contested, including within Turkey. The Kemalist tradition that still has significant institutional support in the military, in the judiciary, in the secular urban professional class, regards the rehabilitation of the Ottoman past with a specific alarm of the tradition that has defined itself in opposition to that past, and that sees in its rehabilitation the specific threat of the secularist revolution being undone. The specific political battles of contemporary Turkey over the headscarf, over the curriculum, over the conversion of Hagia Sophia from a museum back to a mosque, over the specific institutional relationship between the state and religious authority, are the specific contemporary form of the argument about what Turkey is, an argument that goes back to Kemal's ambulance morning revolution and has never been fully resolved. The Hagia Sophia reconversion in 2020, Erdogan's decision to convert the building that Kemal had made into a museum back into an active mosque, was the specific symbolic act that crystallized the rehabilitation of the Ottoman past as the political project. The Hagia Sophia had been a Byzantine church for nearly 1,000 years, an Ottoman mosque for nearly 500 years, and a Kemalist museum for nearly a century. Its reconversion to a mosque was simultaneously the reversal of the Kemalist symbolic settlement and the assertion of the Ottoman legacy as the positive inheritance that the Turkish state was choosing to claim. The Greek government protested. The American State Department expressed concern. The Muslim world largely applauded. The building that has been the specific physical intersection of Byzantine and Ottoman and Turkish Republican history for 1,600 years became, again, the specific contested symbol of the argument about what the history means and who gets to claim it. The empire returns in the Arab world in a different form, in the specific ambivalent relationship that the Arab world has with its Ottoman past. The Arab nationalist tradition that formed in the late Ottoman period and defined itself in opposition to Ottoman Turkish domination has been the dominant framework through which the Arab world has understood its Ottoman experience. The Ottoman centuries were the centuries of subordination to a Turkish ruling class, of Arabic being treated as a secondary language in the empire's administration, of the Arab world's political aspirations being managed by Istanbul rather than expressed independently. The Arab nationalist, who celebrates the Arab revolt and the liberation from Ottoman rule, is the standard figure of the modern Arab political imagination. But the empire also returns in the Arab world in the specific form of the comparison between the Ottoman period and what came after it. The century since the Ottoman collapse has not been kind to the Arab world. The mandates, the failed states, the authoritarian governments, the wars, the specific grinding failure of the political arrangements that replaced Ottoman administration to produce anything resembling the stability and relative prosperity that the Ottoman period had at its better moments provided. These failures have produced in some quarters of the Arab world the specific nostalgic reassessment of the Ottoman period as not so bad actually compared to the alternatives that followed it. This nostalgia is not universal, and it is not uncomplicated. The Ottoman Empire was an imperial power that extracted revenue from the Arab provinces, conscripted Arab soldiers for its wars, suppressed Arab political expression when it threatened the imperial order. The nostalgia for the Ottoman period is partly the nostalgia for a time before Sykes-Picot, before the mandate borders, before the specific humiliations of the post-Ottoman century, a nostalgia for the predecessor of the disaster rather than for the predecessor itself, but it keeps returning in the specific recurring form of the political argument that the Ottoman framework was more coherent than what replaced it, and that the Arab world might have been better served by a reformed Ottoman system than by the specific, externally imposed arrangement that the mandate powers built. The empire returns in international law in the specific form of the Ottoman-era treaties and concessions that still have legal force in some contexts, the specific jurisdictional questions that arise when the legal arrangements of the Ottoman period intersect with the legal arrangements of the states that succeeded it. The water rights of the Euphrates and Tigris, the specific jurisdictional status of certain territories, the specific legal claims that arise from the unresolved status of the Ottoman public debt. These are the specific practical legal inheritances of the empire that the courts and the diplomats of the successor states occasionally still have to address. And the empire returns in the specific academic intellectual sense of the historical reassessment that each generation conducts of the Ottoman period. The Ottoman studies field has been transformed in the past 3 decades by the opening of the Ottoman archives. The specific enormous collections of documents in Istanbul that the Turkish state has made progressively more available to researchers since the 1980s, and by the development of the scholarly tools and the scholarly community capable of working with those archives. What the archives have revealed is an empire of considerably greater complexity and considerably greater administrative sophistication than the earlier historiography, shaped by the specific biases of the nationalist traditions that formed in opposition to the Ottomans, had allowed. The empire that the archives reveal is not the empire of the nationalist caricature, the corrupt, backward, oppressive machine of the anti-Ottoman tradition. It is the specific, complicated, bureaucratically sophisticated, culturally productive, administratively inventive institution of 600 years of continuous governance over an extraordinarily diverse population. It had its specific failures, and its specific violences, and its specific injustices, which the archives also document, but it also had its specific achievements, which the archives document with equal specificity, and the honest historical assessment requires acknowledging both. The ghost of the Ottoman Empire is the ghost of the largest and longest-lasting Islamic political entity in history. The empire that held the caliphate, that administered the holy cities, that governed the majority of the world's Muslims at its height, that produced one of the great architectural, legal, and cultural traditions of the human civilization. Its fall left a void that has not been filled, not by the Arab states that replaced it in the Middle East, not by the Turkish Republic that replaced it in Anatolia, not by any of the other successor states and political institutions that have tried in their various ways to organize the political life of the populations the empire once governed. The ghost keeps returning because the void keeps calling. The specific questions that the Ottoman Empire answered, however imperfectly, however unequally, with whatever violence and whatever injustice, are questions that the political arrangements of its successor states have not answered more satisfactorily. Who governs the diverse communities of the Middle East? What is the relationship between Islamic religious authority and political power? What holds together the specific various peoples of Anatolia and the Arab world and the Balkans in any kind of political community? How does the Muslim world relate to modernity, to the West, to the specific challenges of the 21st century? The Ottoman Empire had answers to these questions. The answers were the answers of a specific historical moment, imperfect, contested, often unjust, but they were answers. The century since the empire's fall has been in significant part the century of the Muslim and Middle Eastern world trying to find better answers. The specific difficulty of that search, the specific repeated failures of the post-Ottoman political arrangements to produce something more satisfactory than what they replaced, is the specific reason the ghost keeps coming back. The ambulance is gone, The Sultan is long dead. The empire is a museum and a television series and an archive and a political argument and the specific borders of 11 modern states and the unresolved questions of 3 ongoing conflicts and the word for coffee in every language of the region it once governed. The Ottoman Empire fell after 600 years of rule. It has not finished falling yet. Conclusion: the ambulance turning the corner. What the Ottoman fall means for the world it left behind. The ambulance turned the corner, and the empire ended, not with the thunder of the siege guns at Constantinople in 1453, when Mehmed II was 21 years old and had just changed the world, not with the Janissary bands and the silk banners and the specific theatrical magnificence of the Ottoman court at its height, not even with the specific desperate violence of the wars that consumed the empire's last decades. The 600-year empire, the empire that had besieged Vienna twice, that had controlled 3 continents, that had been the most feared military power in the world for centuries, that had produced the Suleimaniye and the Topkapi, and the legal code and the coffee house, ended in the back of a British ambulance at 6 in the morning, with one sultan looking back once at the palace before the ambulance turned the corner, and he did not look back again. The specific manner of the ending tells you something about what the empire had become by the end. Diminished, occupied, managed, its sovereignty so thoroughly compromised that its last ruler departed not in a warship of his own, but in a vehicle provided by the foreign power whose occupation of his capital he could not prevent. The empire that had expelled the Crusaders, that had devastated the Venetian fleet, that had made the Holy Roman emperors tremble, departed in a borrowed ambulance. History occasionally produces endings of perfect symbolic appropriateness, but the ending is not the whole story. The ending is what remains after the story, the inheritance that the empire left behind, the world that the fall produced, the specific various consequential things that the Ottoman collapse set in motion and that the subsequent century has been working through. The inheritance is enormous, and it is everywhere. It is in the borders of Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Palestine. The specific lines that the Mandate powers drew on maps of Ottoman territory, and that have contained the specific unresolvable tensions of the communities they enclosed for a century. It is in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the specific collision of 2 nationalisms in the specific territory, that the Ottoman collapse left undetermined, and that the Mandate system could not resolve. It is in the Kurdish question, the specific situation of the largest stateless people in the world, distributed across 4 countries, their national aspirations consistently sacrificed to the interests of the states that control their territories. It is in the Armenian question, the specific, unacknowledged genocide whose denial has shaped Turkish politics for a century and whose resolution remains one of the unfinished businesses of the 20th century. It is in the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, the specific violence of the nationalisms that formed in the Ottoman period and were mobilized in the post-Yugoslav collapse into the worst atrocities in Europe since the Second World War. It is in the political culture of the Arab world, the specific deep suspicion of the Western powers who promised Arab independence and delivered French and British imperial administration, a suspicion that has shaped Arab politics from Nasser to the Arab Spring and beyond. It is in Turkey itself, the specific, complicated, successful, troubled state that Kemal built on the Ottoman rubble, that has spent a century negotiating its relationship with the Ottoman past through phases of adamant rejection and phases of nostalgic reappropriation, that has not resolved the specific questions of what Turkey is and where it fits in the world that the Ottoman collapse left open. The Turkey of the 21st century is making different choices from the Turkey of Kemal's design. More Islamic in its public culture, more assertive in its foreign policy, more willing to invoke the Ottoman past as a source of national pride and regional influence. And those choices are the specific choices of a state still working through the consequences of the empire it replaced. And it is in the political vocabulary of the present, in the concept of the sick man, in the phrase balkanization, in the specific evocative shorthand of the terms that the Ottoman period contributed to the political language of the world that came after it. These phrases are used by people who have never thought about the Ottoman Empire to describe situations whose Ottoman origins they are unaware of. The language of the empire has outlasted the empire itself. Embedded in the political vocabulary of the world that the empire's fall created, the Ottoman Empire is gone. But the questions it left behind have not been answered. The borders it drew, or rather the borders that were drawn in its absence through its corpse, are still contested. The peoples it governed are still sorting out their relationship to the states that replaced it. The genocide it committed has not been acknowledged by the state that considers itself its successor. The caliphate it held has not been revived in any form the Muslim world recognizes. And the specific absence of the central Islamic political institution that the Ottomans had provided for 4 centuries is felt in the specific, fragmented, contested landscape of contemporary Sunni political Islam. Was the fall inevitable? Probably, in the sense that the specific structural pressures of the 19th century world bore on the Ottoman Empire with the force of conditions that no individual decision could simply overcome. Probably not inevitable in the specific, particular form it took: the genocide, the specific borders, the specific violence of the end, the specific manner of the departure. The ambulance did not have to be borrowed. The Sultan did not have to look back once and then not look back again. The empire did not have to leave in the dark, but it did, and the world that it left behind, the specific, complicated, fractured, extraordinary world that the fall of 600 years of empire produced, is the world in which we are standing on the roof of the building in Istanbul, watching the city that was once Constantinople, that was once the capital of the most powerful empire in the world, that is now the largest city in Europe, that is still working out what exactly it is and what it owes to what it was. The Bosphorus still runs between Europe and Asia. The Suleymaniye still stands on the hill above the Golden Horn. The bazaar is still a bazaar, and the questions the empire left behind are still the questions we are trying to answer. 600 years of empire, one ambulance, one glance back at the palace, and everything that followed.